Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Good evening and welcome. I'm Councillor Louise Bryce, the Chairman of the Corporate Services Policy Advisory Committee, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this meeting of the committee this evening. The meeting will be broadcast live and recorded for playback on the Council's YouTube channel. Will anyone else be recording the proceedings? We ask so that people at the meeting will know if this will be happening. Can't see anyone indicating. If the fire alarm sounds during the meeting, members please remain seated and members of the Democratic Services team will assess the situation and give further instructions on the evacuation of the building if necessary. Turning to item 1, apologies. We have received apologies for absence from Councillor Mrs Gooch and Councillor Cathcart. Are there any other apologies? No. So item 2, substitute members. Are there any substitute members? Councillor Mumford?
Councillor Mumford for Councillor Mrs Fay Gooch.
Thank you, Councillor Mumford. And Councillor English?
Councillor English for Councillor Cathcart.
Thank you, Councillor English. Turning to item 3, urgent items. We have no urgent items this evening. Item 4, visiting members. I cannot see any visiting members. So item 5, disclosures by members and officers. Are there any disclosures by members or officers? I cannot see anybody indicating, so we'll move on to item 6, disclosures of lobbying. Have any members been lobbied? No, no disclosures of lobbying. Thank you, members. Turning to item 7, to consider whether any items should be taken in private because of possible disclosure exempt information. I move that all items be taken in public as proposed. Is that agreed, members? Thank you kindly. Item 8, minutes of the meeting held on the 6th of February 2023, circulated separately. I move that the minutes of the meeting held on the 6th of February 2023 be approved as a correct record and signed. Is that agreed, members? Thank you very much. Okay, item 9, question and answer session for members of the public. We do not have any members of the public this evening, so we don't have any presentation of petitions under item 10. And I don't think we have any questions from members to the chairman either. So we move to item 12. So item 12 is the forward plan relating to the committee's terms of reference. It's on pages 1 through 3. So I refer members to the forward plan. Page 3 relates to the remit of this committee, Corporate Services Policy Advisory Committee. Councillor Perry, as our lead member, would you like to give any updates on the forward plan?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Yes, I'll just give a brief introduction. First of all, I'd like to thank James Wilderspin for the work he's done on this. It's an excellent piece of work, and I think we all can see that. Oh, sorry, I thought we were on to the... this covers the same thing, actually, so I don't know why. I apologise.
Okay, it is covering broadly the same item, but I didn't know if you wanted to save your comments to the next item.
Of course, yes. Apologies, Madam Chairman, I was being facetious. So.
No, you're absolutely fine. So I move that the forward plan be noted. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you, members. Okay, right. Councillor Perry. Item 13, members. Biodiversity and Climate Change Action Plan Annual Review. So.
It's not often you get a chance to have a rehearsal, is it, before you start? This is obviously the Fire Diversity and Climate Action Plan, and it's part of the review. We agreed to carry out an annual review, basically to bring it up to date and to take into account any changes or any new targets that might be around. And this is basically what this plan is about. One of the things that has been agreed, I think, or decided on, rather than agree, that's a bit too formal, that we should separate out the items where we can have a direct controller over, which I think is very important, and those items where we can influence. And again, there are quite a few items in that category. Though I would say that I think a lot of the items that are on the corporate services side, and they are buildings related, a lot of it, and construction related. These items we do have some direct control over, and when we come to it, you'll see in the actions there are about 10 actions that are allocated to corporate services, and of those, at least 5 of them are either building or construction related. Things like charging, lighting, heating, these type of things, and we do have a very good direct control over. So, in summary, we have something like 38, I think, quite succinct actions. Part of the review was to tidy up some of the English and make it a little bit clearer, which I think we've done. And so we got some 38 actions, of which, as I said, something around about 10 are directly responsible in this area. Although I would add, I think, that this whole climate and biodiversity action plan really affects across the board. So it's a pretty well a united cross subject that I think affects us all. I'd just like to say that I would like to recommend this action plan to you. I think it's very, very good. I think this is such an important subject that we must take extremely seriously. What we're trying to do is to meet those targets where we can get to a now agreed position of being net zero by, I think, 2030, I think was the Council's decision. And I think that's an absolutely right approach. I can say I have my 4 grandchildren with me over the Easter holiday, and it's their future that we are discussing here. And I think that is something that we all must take extremely seriously. But if you look at some of the action points, particularly if you go to 5.3, 6.8, 7.1, 7.2, then on to 9.2, 9.3, these are all points that look particular actions that we, I believe, can either directly control or have a very strong influence on. So I commend the report to you, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Councillor Perry. We also have our officer team here, James Wilderspin and obviously Mr. Green. So members, if you have any questions, we have an expert team here to take us through it. So the items that particularly relate to this committee are 1.4, 5.3, 6.8, 7.1, 7.2, 7.3, 7.5, 9.2, 9.3, 9.5. So I have Councillor Harper and then Councillor English indicating. Councillor Harper, would you like to start us off?
Okay, thank you. I think overall this is a good plan. I had a chance, and I know Louise and Bob were there, to discuss a bit of it when we were at Economic Regeneration and Leisure last week, or the week before. The only thing what I think is missing, as it's laid out here, is a bit of context, because we've got the actions, if you like, looking forward, but what we don't have is anything give us an idea of, you know, what we've been doing since October 2020, when the original plan was presented. And I just wonder if perhaps in the future, when we receive a report like this, we can have a bit of, the context of looking back of, what we've achieved, because there's a lot of ambition here, which I approve of for 23-24 for next year. But it's difficult to know how sort of achievable that would be, because it's not clear from here how many objectives we managed, if you like, to finish off in the year we're just finishing. I mean, if we got through 20 or 30 in the year just gone, then having 20 or 30 for next year is probably not unreasonable. But if we only finished off 1 or 2 last, the year we're just finishing, then having this volume of activity for next year maybe, I'm trying to, not quite a wish list, but just, stuff which may end up taking more than 1 year. So I think overall very good, but it'd just be useful for future reports just to have a bit of context. And a couple of questions on the items for this committee. Let me just find the page. Yeah, it was on item 7.1, which is page 21. And John was mentioning about buildings and so on. And obviously, if we think of some of our main public buildings, we've got this building, the Town Hall, we've got Maidstone House, we've got the Leisure Centre, and obviously Maidstone Museum. And I think we'd all support the idea of being completely net zero by 2030. But when we think of that sort of mixture of buildings, as say the museum, this building, Maidstone House, and the Leisure Centre, it would be useful to understand a bit more about the timeline, because you're talking about a 5-year phasing here as to where, do we think most of the work will be done in the next 12 months, or do we think it, if you like, will be more towards the end of the period? So that's my first question.
Thank you, Councillor Harper. I think it's a really good point in terms of thinking about how we measure this going forward, and whether or not we kind of leave some done actions kind of in there to tick off. So I don't know if we want to cover that and amend the recommendation slightly to cover that. We'll have a think about that maybe. But that particular point on the challenge of those different buildings would be really welcome if you've got some context there.
Yeah, I can try to fill in some of that. So this decarbonising each of the buildings is has taken a year so far just to highlight which buildings are the biggest carbon emitters, and we've sorry, can you hear me now? We've worked with APSI Energy, who have conducted studies on each of the buildings, and they've completed those assessments now. So we have a understanding of what upgrades and retrofits each of the buildings will look like. The idea with that information is to put it into a pathway, a decarbonisation pathway, and to show which buildings are priorities and which ones we can leave until later in the decade. And then with that pathway set out, we can apply for funding when it comes from national government as well. So there's the Public Sector Decarbonisation Fund, and the next opening of that fund is in September. So by then we should have the list of buildings that we're looking to upgrade and put it towards that funding. And then each year look to do something similar until the buildings have hit as near to net zero as possible. And the last thing to say is on the grade listed buildings, you're right, those are much more difficult to get down to net zero. And so we'll be also looking at offsetting schemes and energy schemes that we can look at to completely get to net zero as well. So a combination in the future as well.
That's really...
Thank you for that. Actually, that sort of leads on in a sense to my next point, which was on 7.3 on the following page, which is aiming to have things such as, you say offsets. I think that's what. And also, it might have been, it was one of the ones for this committee where we were talking about having a carbon neutral fleet, and I just wondered quite how we were going to fully achieve that, because I do remember probably a couple of years ago sitting here in a committee meeting when at Policy and Resources it was, and we were discussing, I think, the forthcoming retendering of our waste disposal contracts and so on. And I do remember being told by the officers it was unlikely that the refuse freighters would be able to become electric powered just because of the amount of mileage they're doing to and from doing the pickups and getting up to, presumably it's Allington and then back and so on. So I just wondered how perhaps technology may have moved on even in the last couple of years in terms of, you know, achieving that, because that must be one of our biggest parts of fleet is the refuse.
If you can pick that up, James.
Yeah, that's so for the last year now we've had fleet telematics software installed in every vehicle in the council. So that's given us a good understanding of how the vehicles are performing and their idle time and how much mileage they're doing. So now that we've captured that data and capturing that in the carbon footprint, we know what our carbon footprint is for the fleet. There's also been a green fleet strategy developed by the waste team. And so the idea there is that for when a vehicle comes to the end of its life, they will look at the viability of upgrading it to an electric equivalent. And that at the moment still means that smaller vehicles and up to transit vans is a viable option because the types of electric vehicles to that size on the market are comparable to petrol. But for bigger vehicles, the recommendation over the next decade is to kind of wait and see what happens with hydrogen and other fuel types that will be able to go longer term or further distance, like a stopping and starting refuse vehicle. So at the moment, the way the Green Fleet strategy will work is that the smaller vehicles for parks and street cleansing are probably the priority, and the bigger, more expensive electric vehicles towards the end of the decade. Yeah, thank you.
Does that help, Councillor Harper? It's interesting,
Just one
isn't it?
final thing, and then at our meeting at Economic Regeneration and Leisure, we had the leader, and he talked a lot about the idea of carbon budgeting and so on. So I just really wanted to commend the proposals in here for that, for looking at carbon accounting. I spoke with David only earlier today, and I think we would, you know, ask the executive to push that element on as fast as possible, because the quicker we can get to a stage when we have any committee report, we have elements relating to carbon accounting, I think we're going to be in a far better position to assess how we're moving forward on the whole issue of carbon reduction. But I mean, that's already sort of built into the work. I just wanted to highlight that because it struck me as really important from our discussions before. Thank you.
I think it comes in you know, what the officer was just saying as well, in terms of, you know, having those telematics on the vehicles to be able to then inform what you need to replace them with and then how to migrate it. So that kind of data orientated approach then allows you to make more informed decisions, doesn't it? Councillor English, you were next.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Generally, an extremely good report, encouraging. I'll just observe that the report does reference the interaction between officers and the executive. I think it's worth noting that there's been a completed scrutiny review on waste and a partly almost completed scrutiny review first stage on the water cycle. Comments from both have been fed into officers and the cabinet in such a way as far as I can see, some of those things have actually come out in this report. So it would have been nice somewhere in the report summary to actually acknowledge that there's been interaction with both arms of the council and not just the executive. That's just a minor criticism, but for the sake of completeness, that would be nice. In terms of this, my question, as opposed to my slight rant, is in terms of what I just said, we're going to have we're almost at the end of the to-ing and fro-ing on the waste strategy review, and we're going to be reporting to scrutiny tomorrow on the first stage report on the water cycle. So this is a document that gets reviewed periodically. What I'm really asking is how will this document be updated in relation to actually take on board those points that are going to come through in that review. And secondly, just an observation, a lot of these things do, because they involve expenditure, capital finance, although they actually fall under other committees, they will end up with also crossing over to Councillor Perry's responsibility, because inevitably there'd be major capital sums or revenue sums or grant applications involved. Just an observation that they may end up at this committee anyway.
Thank you, Councillor English. I'm going to bring in Councillor Cook, because I think you've got a similar question in terms of how the report kind of is tracked.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Not so much a question, more an observation similar to Clive. I think this is an excellent document, and I think it shows that the Council's moving in the right direction and recognising the need for appropriate and sustainable action in relation to carbon reduction, and doing that, as I say, in a sustainable way. But as we do that, and I think this is the point that Clive was attempting to make, we need to be able to monitor that and measure that, so we can see what our performance is in this very, very important area. And I think when we look at section 9, the sustainable decision-making processes and governance, I think we're missing a 9.6, frankly, Madam Chairman, and that is that to recognise that this is a living document and will need and will of necessity need to evolve with time and with technology as new things come in that time frame, and they will. But more important than that, we need to recognise where we are and measure our process towards our targets. And if we're not able to do that, we won't know when we arrive at the destination, because we're in the absence of that, how do we say, well, okay, we're now at net zero? So I think we do need a 9.6. I'm not going to take a stab at suggesting a wording for it, but I do think there needs to be something there that recognises the need to measure and report and evolve, and so people know that we are actually delivering on this document, and this document represents a very, very important promise to the residents of Maidstone. So if the officers could come up with a suitable wording, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cook. So it's kind of built in to the action plan itself that there will be an annual review process. So this started that with that process back in November. The leader of the council took the opportunity to say that some of these actions weren't progressing because the target dates were being pushed back, or because we didn't have a clear line of accountability with the officers. So the new action plan, I think, is much clearer. It's been cut down where there had been areas that were duplicated. It's now clearer which officers responsible and which pack that will go to. And so as part of that, if I can refer to action 9.2, I've already had another comment that that's not the clearest action, but to set up performance indicators for all of the actions within the officers and the different departments, so that they are able to see the difference and measure the difference and be able to report that to each pack is part of this process. Every 6 months, the action plan will be reported on. I think it was the 4th.
Can I just interrupt very quickly? Where does it say that in the action plan about every 6 months?
It doesn't in this. I think it's on the web page underneath the original action plan. So if it doesn't.
So we need a 9.6.
Okay. Yep. No, that's a good comment.
So we're looking at 8.2, which is is that 8.2 that
Sorry,
you...
9.2 is
9.2.
the performance indicator.
Here we go, 9.2. Hang on, Councillor Cook. So we've got 9.2. Ensure service plans consider biodiversity and climate change and monitor with performance indicators so that managers plan their services to ensure opportunities for enhancing biodiversity and mitigating and adapting to climate change to ensure, oh, there's a comma needed there, to ensure to ensure opportunities for enhancing biodiversity, comma, mitigating and adapting to climate change are taken. Yes, I think you're right in terms of the wording could be slightly tightened there. Do we think that the review point sits there, members, potentially if we're going to recommend an amendment, if the thrust of 9.2 is to look at how we measure and monitor, which I think is what you're saying, isn't it? That rather than create an additional line? What do you think, Councillor Cook? I can see you want to come back in.
Well, I was going to say, really, I'll be governed by the majority on that. I'm not too bothered whether we have that as an additional line or we add some wording or maybe clarify para 9.2 to incorporate the point and cover it that way. But what I do think is the point needs to be covered, and at the moment it's not. So I'm really not worried whether we do it in 9.2 or an additional. It might be cleaner to do it in an additional line, which clearly sets out the review process and the way that review process will be handled from a timeline point of view.
So I think 9.2 is about making sure that managers plan their services with KPIs in place. And I think what we're asking for is that that is an implementation directive, but that actually the wider plan comes back to be monitored and progress measured. And I think that comes back to Councillor Harper's original point in terms of measuring and logging what actions have been already achieved. So I think we know we want to do something, but I've got a few more members indicating to speak. So if we take a few more comments and maybe come back to that if we can, because we might pick up a little bit more of the discussion. So I've got Councillor Cox and Councillor Cannon, and then Councillor Brindle and Councillor Harper again. Councillor Cox?
Thank you very much. I've been trying to see whether just the endorsement of what we're trying to put on paper here is achievable in an easier way. We're trying to see the progress and the achievement that we've made so far, but it's got to be how we're progressing to a target. So we've got the time scale, but the time scale is almost, we've heard it moves, or the government might move something. And I wonder whether key performance indicator doesn't really sound right. I know that's what you're performing, but I wondered if we could have a progress to target achievement or something like that, because I think, and it should be almost on a dashboard, because I think we need to be able to see, we can see all this work's being done, but we can't see how far along the line we've got, and indeed what money's been spent and what we've got left to go. And then you said, and I was like, oh, I didn't think of that, about new technology. Because if something comes in that's new technology and hydrogen becomes more achievable and usable, those dashboards will go, hang on, we can now, look what we've just done. But that's because we waited. Because people could argue, you're not doing enough, you're not doing it quickly. Whereas we could understand that something is at the end of the tunnel, and if we take that on board once it's got correct, then people will understand that's why we've waited, that's why we haven't spent this money, because we knew we needed to keep it. So I just think what has been said is absolutely true, but I just think it's almost, we need to have new wording to explain what we're trying to see happen. Is that waffly enough?
No, I've written percentage achieved as a kind of, I don't know if it's an extra column, because things like, for example, I know it's not in our remit, but we've got key performance indicator for 7.6, deliver 100% LED lighting in NBC car parks. Well, we can say how much of that we've done, can't we? So I think that I understand the challenges. Lots of us have served on policy and resources of setting KPIs. They can be a little bit clunky at times, can't they, to get exactly the right measure. But I think giving you some flexibility there to say KPI or percentage achieved or something would be useful, just to note progress. And then the other thing which is what you're suggesting, isn't it? I think, Councillor Cox. If we're going to do that, we do need to number these bullet points because there's a lot in them. So you want to say action 8.1, 8.11, 8.1.2. Otherwise, when you come to track it, you'll struggle to or plan against it. That's just a.
And my last
Yes,
point was
Councillor
more
Cox.
of a question. I'm very much behind if we can achieve something on those lines. Could we see this document that sets out what our buildings are achieving, how they're helping, and if we need to offset? Because one of our latest acquisitions, obviously, Loch Meadow, that looks one of the biggest empty pieces of roof that we have. I mean, even if the market had EV panels on there and a bank of batteries, and we could say almost Loch Meadow is running carbon neutral, that would be an achievement. Something that the public use frequently and see. I think that's the sort of flag we should be raising, because I think people think a lot of this is just frittering away money or frittering away timelines, and I think showing them things like that when they walk in, you're in a carbon neutral environment, or the buildings you're in are totally run by solar, if that's the way that we're looking. Those are the 2 points. Thank you.
So, Councillor Cox, you're suggesting that we add in a requirement to, or a suggestion to add specific plans on the buildings, on that particular point on
My
estate.
question really raised and said, are such buildings, because we haven't seen this document, unless I've missed it, it would be handy for us to know what your plans are after having that document prepared, so that we can not just blithely go, well, Loch Meadow's completely empty, because you could say, well, actually, it isn't, because we've got it earmarked, because the document came up with the proposal rather than us doing it on the fly. So I'd like to see that document as a committee. Thank you.
So APSI Energy and these documents on each building were completed in January, February this year, so they're hot off the press. We targeted the 10 buildings in the town centre and also the crematorium, the depot. For Loch Meadow, we're trying to align it with funding. So each building looks to be about £1 million or more to retrofit heating, or to look at insulation, or to look at solar. It depends on what's best for the building and how to get it near to net zero. So I've been working with the finance team to put it all into a big matrix and to show where the priorities are in terms of which buildings are emitting the most carbon, where the most savings will be made if we upgrade the heating or the insulation. So all of that's still being worked on, and it will be part of this decarbonisation pathway coming soon. Just in terms of the Loch Meadow and the solar, because we're trying to align it with the funding, the biggest carbon emitting buildings are more viable to get more funding. So actually Maidstone House and the museum and the Archbishop's Palace are more likely to get funding than Loch Meadow, which is a newer building, even though it has potential for a lot of solar. So again, it's balancing whether we want to make that public statement and invest in that, or whether we want to get to net zero, and which one we want to do first.
I thought you said there could be offsetting. Surely there is no space on top of that Maidstone house to put any sort of amount of square meterage.
Yeah.
Surely you would offset, because the availability of pitched space is massive on the two buildings I mentioned. That's all I'm saying. We could see this and we wouldn't have to ask, if maybe when we get it bound in Father Christmas's box set then, or something, I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. No, there's different mechanisms for offsetting. I was thinking in terms of buying the renewable, but we can, if we actually invest in the solar PV itself and offset building by building, that's another way of doing it. So yeah, absolutely, that'd be part of this decarbonisation plan, and then which building and which priorities go first, and how we get the funding for that is open for discussion.
Thank you, Councillor Cox. Councillor Cannon?
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I'm really impressed with the strategic nature of the document. Its long-term outlook and some of the sensible things that we mentioned about hydrogen and the approach to not rushing into electric and waiting. That's very strategic and sensible decision making. So I'm really glad to hear about that, and also some of the achievable goals and the focus on what we can control as a council as well. I think it's important because documents like this on this topic can go off into sort of elsewhere. So I think that's really, really good that we're focusing on things like the estate, the parking provision, and the things that we can actually make a difference on. My one comment, and it's related to a previous item that's come to this committee, which is the procurement policy. So on 9.5 it says sustainable procurement, but then on action 8.3 it says localised supply chains, and we have discussed that point before, so I won't go into it in depth, but there is a slight conflict between our procurement policy and sustainable procurement and localised supply chains and encouraging localised supply chains. So I don't want to drag that all up again, but I just wanted to raise to this committee again and to the officers that I think it's important that we are still buying and supporting Maidstone businesses, and those two aims work together, and we don't ever say no to a Maidstone business because it's not sustainable enough. So thank you.
Yeah, it's a well-made point, Councillor Cannon, and as you say, something we've touched on before. So I don't know if we need to amend the action plan as such. I don't know what you think, Mr. Green, because we've discussed this before, haven't we, in terms of how we balance that want to support localised businesses, but then also achieve this wider aim of looking at carbon accounting.
My suggestion would be that the point is just noted in the minutes. You're right, Councillor Cannon, it's a point that's been made before, and we're well aware of the tension there. But given that we touch on both issues in the action plan, I'd suggest we don't need to actually change the action plan.
No, I would say that when we're looking at developing these procurement strategies, I'm just looking at it to reduce carbon footprint. Well, whilst referring to, we could circle it back and say and add clause onto 9.5 to say noting the desire to promote localised supply chains. So it's just added in there. Yeah. Councillor Perry, sorry.
Yes, I was just going to come in on this one, 9.5, because I think the strategy that we now have, and I think has been put forward, actually takes this into account. So in effect, when I read this, I thought this is one action, actually, we're pretty well on the ball, and it's pretty well spot on, because it's exactly what we're doing. So, yeah, note it if you want, but all I'm saying is that we're doing it, and I think the strategy covers it. Thank you.
Okay, if we feel the strategy covers it and we're noting it in the minutes, then unless anybody has a strong desire, we'll leave it as is with that feedback.
I just want to support Councillor Perry's point. We don't. If there is a danger in absolutes, as sometimes suggested. We can all think of the exceptional local business that is local, but is an appalling business that we wouldn't necessarily want to accept support just because they're local. And so, absolutes can be dangerous, and so I think it is balanced, and that is what we need.
Thank you, Councillor English, for your comments. I'm going to go to Councillor Brindle because she hasn't spoken yet, and then I'll come back to you, Councillor Harper.
Thank you. Whilst I accept that it will be a good idea to have an update on the actual action plan, I'm looking at 7.3 on page 9, which says progress of the implementation of the actions will continue to be monitored and updates given to the relevant packs on a 6-monthly basis. I just wondered in what format that will be coming to us, because it may well be that we'll get the relevant updates, hopefully, but I'm not certain what format that will come to us.
So you're looking for clarity on it's in the report, it's not on page 9 rather than in the action plan 7.3. Yeah, page 9. Yeah. So your question is, in what format would that be delivered, and potentially
Yes,
will it go to all committees that are mentioned in the
I
plan?
presume it will go to all committees, but I'm wondering what kind of content we'll get on those updates, because it may well mean that we'll get the relevant information we're looking for in an update rather than having it an extra column which will squeeze it all up a bit on the actual format of the document we're reviewing tonight.
Thank you, Councillor Brindle.
So I think it will follow the same pattern it did before. So every 6 months there was, as Appendix 1 is set out, it shows the performance indicator. There'll be a column in terms of what's happened most recently and since the last monitoring phase, and then every 6 months after that, that will be updated and compared to the next column. So it will be a 6-monthly written note about what has been achieved in that time and how much further there is towards the target. That's what was happening for the last 2 years in terms of updates. So I imagine it will take the same.
So will that not cover what we're discussing now? Or am I missing something? If we're looking to have a progress against the plan, will that 6-monthly update not cover that? Or am I looking at this from a different angle? Yeah. Yes.
Are you asking, will it be enough detail and how will it be presented? I suggested earlier a dashboard or something that tracks progress against where we are.
Because it's such a wide-ranging action plan, there are different ways to do it. So for the planning elements, the ones that overlap with strategic planning, they have a 6-monthly monitoring for things like the biodiversity net gain and the buildings that are being built to a certain specification for climate adaptation. So those will be part of their monitoring and will be reported in here as well, at how many buildings that is or how many EV chargers have gone. Those monitoring systems are set up. For other areas like tree planting, it will be towards the Kent County Council's target or whatever we set as part of this action plan, so how many trees have gone in the ground to which we're working towards. But the main one, the biggest and clearest picture would be the amount of carbon the council is emitting, and that's being worked into a dashboard. And so every building, every vehicle will be automated and fed into that dashboard, and on a 6-month basis we can see if it's going up or down. So it depends on which elements of the action plan we're talking about. Some of them will have very clear numeric indicators, and others will be officers saying where that has got to in the process, I think. Yeah, well, if there's more comments in terms of how it needs to be reported back and what would be the most useful way, that would be useful. But yeah, how it's worked in the past, there's been a note from officers in terms of where it is at, and now that we have these clear monitoring systems, that will be updated as part of that process. So hopefully it will be clearer.
Yeah, I think there's so I think there's some work to be done there, isn't there, to kind of work out how you're kind of monitoring this in the detail in which it's laid out. And it's whether or not we need to capture that in a recommendation, or whether or not 7.3 provides us with enough enough direction of travel. But it's that the kind of information about the dashboard as well, it's kind of inferred, but I don't know, is it specified here? Councillor Harper, I can see you itching to come back in.
Well, I was thinking perhaps the latter. I'm wondering whether, in addition to our recommendation 1 we've got on page 5, that I think there might be a second recommendation, because most of what's been said, everyone seems to think it's a good plan, but we're just concerned about the monitoring and not understanding how we're progressing against it. Now, I know there's that reference which Anne pointed out on the 7.3, but I'm just wondering whether we should actually formally ask the executive, and I've started to scribble down some words, so it's only an idea, something like ask the executive to consider, when presenting future updates and forward plans, to provide a review process of the previous periods and the impact achieved so far. It's just so it's very clear that that's what we're asking for. What we need to know is how are we doing, And so we've got the context to know whether actually we're on track or we're so far behind. There's no point agreeing anything new because we've got a lot of retrospective work to do. Now, I'm not precious on the words, but I just wondered if an extra recommendation to reinforce that type of point could be quite useful given the discussion we've had this evening.
Councillor Cook, I can see you want to add to this.
Just very briefly, Madam Chairman, I sympathise with what Councillor Harper's saying. I think we need to draw a line in the sand. I think the point of going backwards and measuring what we've done is almost really is not going to be that helpful. What we do need to know is where we are at the moment in terms of what those buildings are throwing out. And I think the officer said that this is revised and updated quite recently. So the plan emanates from where we are. So I think what we need to do is to understand where we are without necessarily going back beyond that. So you've got a start point, and with a start point, you can plot out your journey to your end point. And what I'm looking for is being able to measure on a 6-monthly basis, maybe. Personally, I'd be happy with an annual basis. I think 6 monthly might be too often on something like this. But where we are at that given point in time, so whether it's an annual or 6 monthly, I just want to be able to have a look at it and see what progress we've made and how the plan is delivering on the promise. Because if it's not, then maybe we've got to do something in addition, or So that's what I'm trying to get to, and I think Councillor Harper might be indeed right that a part B to the recommendation may be the way to achieve that. I'm happy to be. I'm looking for an outcome right here, that delivers what I think we're all trying to express, and I think there's a lot of agreement across both sides of the chamber.
Thank you, Councillor Cook. I'm going to bring back in the officer here to give us some feedback on this.
So, like I said before, because it's such a all-encompassing action plan and it goes to different service areas, and the last action plan wasn't clear in terms of transparency and accountability to those officers, and even if those officers knew that they had the action, it's not necessarily within their work remit to monitor something that's for climate change. So I think this newer version of the action plan makes that more clear, and I've worked with the officers so they know what elements I'm looking for to capture as part of the action plan. In Appendix 1, we've listed the key performance indicators. These are key ones throughout the action plan that will give an indication of how those are going. So, like I mentioned, number of electric vehicles and number of electric vehicle charging points, number of EV taxis working in the town centre. So there are numbers like that that we can monitor and update on, so you can see it towards progress. The difficulty is if we change the targets, then those numbers won't reflect the change in the target. So I think the solution could be that we have somewhere that we list or have every action that we've completed as achievements or something like that, so we can see where we've come from, and that maybe that's a way to show what we've done so far. But on actions and building that progress forward, checking that, monitoring it through these indicators, going to the officers and pushing them to push it further, I think is what the leader of the council wanted and how he wanted it to feed back into PACS more clearly, so that we have a mechanism to keep these actions moving.
Thank you, James. I've got Councillor Cannon next.
Yeah, just very briefly on the on capturing and monitoring. I just wanted to ask whether we currently are understanding savings. So I'm going to go on the lights. So if we get 100% LED lighting, will we be able to say well, the lights before cost this much and now they cost this much. So actually, through the plan, we can also say that there's financial savings on certain decisions as well.
Yeah, ideally, yes. So we've got better building by building data, and the officers are more aware of what data we're trying to collect, so they can make those differences, see those differences, and then we can report on it. So absolutely, it'll be a positive story for and the amount of utilities that we cut or savings that we've made and things like that will be reported.
Okay, I've got Councillor Cox and Councillor English, and then we need to take a call, folks, I think, on whether or not we feel we need an extra recommendation or if we feel that 7.3 covers it.
Thank you. 7.2 may cover it, actually. Measure the council's carbon footprint each year and report findings to relevant committees and the public. Portfolio holder, the leader. Monitoring quarterly. So all this has got to be assessed. You need all of this to be fed in quarterly. So therefore, if it's being done quarterly, this report should be able to give us a dashboard because you're putting in the information quarterly. So we may only want it yearly, but it's there quarterly, and that is that's the leader asking for that. So I think it's in here. What I want to hear is you think it's going to work because it's asking the output for scope 1, 2 and 3.
That's the dashboard you were referring to, yeah.
So in terms of carbon, yes, that can be done because we have the fleet telematics, so that's we can collect that data on a week-by-week basis in terms of how much mileage there is. Building by building, we don't have smart meters in every building, but we're collecting utility bills, and we work with Laser, and we can collect that data and feed it all in. So on a periodic, every 3 months, we can collect that data and see where the carbon footprint is. And so that will feed into the dashboard. So that one, for carbon, with our buildings and fleet, it's clear. For the other actions in terms of trees and EV chargers and things like that, they're all different monitoring systems, so they will have different report times and things like that.
Okay, Councillor English?
I think we're sort of going around in circles here and not getting very far. And I think at the end of the day, it's very straightforward, really. Do we think that there's any advantage in having an update of what information is available in whatever different formats it's collected in roughly every 6 months, or don't we? And all we're really arguing about is exactly what information should be in that and what wording is. What we're not going to be able to necessarily narrow that down tonight. So logically, the recommendation will be to ask the executive to consider the best way to present the information as to progress to meeting the targets to this committee on a 6-monthly basis. Because frankly, I think there's further work to be done on the formatting and the presentation of exactly what sort of information, and we could actually be here for another 2 hours discussing this without actually coming to a resolution. So I would suggest something simple like that be added as the second recommendation.
I think that the actions in there that relate to this need a little bit more working up. Yeah, totally. And I think that's where we're getting to. And I think probably the best way of taking it forward is to ask the executive, when they're making the decision, to add in further detail on how they envisage this coming back and being monitored and reported, because I don't think the KPIs are quite. There's lots of these that don't have non-applicable, where actually I think there is a measure of performance and progress that could be illuminated, it could be added. So I think what we're looking for, but it's not really for us, to prescribe exactly what that should look like, because as you're saying, it's so wide-ranging and there's so many different people involved. I don't think it's for us to sit here right now and be too prescriptive about it. So I think what we're really looking for is, you've put all this work into this plan. can we get some feedback on how you think you're going to monitor it, and that monitoring period? We probably would like to come up with a form of words, I feel, to express our desire to see that as a kind of a recommendation back to the executive.
Sorry, I don't know whether Mrs. Snook or anyone got a note of what I actually said, which was to add a second recommendation to the ask the executive to consider further the appropriate way to present the information on how the progress towards meeting these targets has been measured, and how to most advantageously present this to this committee every 6 months.
Appropriate way to give more detail on how progress is being made and will be reported back on a 6-monthly basis to the relevant committees. Could you just give me the opening of your sentence, Councillor English, please?
Oh, it was just to recommend that we ask the executive to consider that.
Recommend the executive consider the appropriate to the relevant committees. Right, this is what I've noted. Okay. You've got to we're giving you the work to do. So we're recommending to the executive to consider the most appropriate way to give more detail on how progress is being made and will be reported back on a 6-monthly, or will be reported on a 6-monthly basis to the relevant committees. So we recommend to the executive to consider the appropriate way of giving more detail on how progress is being made on each action and how this plan will be reported back on a 6-monthly basis to the relevant committees. It's just noting our desire to have a little bit, you've done all this work, and it's just really how can we then best feed it back and track. Granted, the carbon element is going to be provided on a dashboard, and maybe a lot of these elements will also be built into that dashboard, but I suppose it's a desire to be kept up to date with what that's going to look like, and a little bit more flexibility, because a KPI may not be suitable for every action, but there's certainly an element of progress that could be achieved. You're smiling at me, Councillor Mumford, and you haven't spoken yet. Do you want to add anything? You look like you do.
No, I just listen, and really I think what you're saying is the officer comes here and you say, are we going to meet our target? And he'll say yes or no. And if he says no, we say to him, well, how do you know that? I mean, that's what we're saying to the officer. Are we going to meet our target? When he gives us an answer, we ask him how he knew that, and could he provide that information to us next time. It is that simple.
Exactly.
That's what we're interested in, isn't it? To make this a working document. Yeah. Okay, members. So we should. Are you happy with that wording, or does anybody want me to read it back? Okay. So we should vote to add that to the list of recommendations, and then we can take all of the recommendations together. Yes? No? Or we can just take them all together?
You've only got 2 recommendations then. If you've got the recommendation that you recommend it, the actual plan, sorry.
We can take them together, yes.
Can I just, sorry.
Yeah.
Can I just clarify though, if members want to make any changes to the actions or anything within the action plan, or whether you're just adding that second recommendation?
Yeah, because I think the only point. Yeah, that's a good point. I've got Councillor Perry indicating. Thank you, Councillor Cook.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Yeah, it's very quick. I thought what Councillor Mumford said was absolutely spot on. I really do. And I'd like to see, hopefully, that is reflected in whatever we are deciding, recommending to the Executive. So I think exactly what we should be doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Perry. So, members, if we take both of those recommendations together, so I don't know that we need to have a vote on it. Consider and recommend. Oh yeah, you've proposed it. You've seconded it. Yep, there we go. Okay, so members, if you agree with the two recommendations, please raise your hands. That's unanimous. No abstentions. Nobody against. Right, that is the only item that we had, a main item that we had on our agenda tonight.
Madam Chair, can I just raise one item before we finish?
Go on then.
I'd just like to propose a vote of thanks to you as our chair for the work you've done in the last year. I think you've been exemplary in chairing these meetings to get consensus from us all and to make good decisions to recommend on to the executive. So, and also, especially as you're standing down from the council this year, I just think we should make a formal vote of thanks to you for your chairmanship for the last year.
I'd like to second that. The council is suffering a loss, and so the public of Staplehurst in your decision to stand down for good personal reasons. And I'd like to say you made a major contribution to the council, and particularly it's been a pleasure to come to the meetings that you've been chairing this year, unlike some other council meetings I can think of. So my personal thanks and those of my colleagues in my group to the work you've done for Maidstone and chairing this committee in particular.
Oh, thank you, members. Very kind. It's an absolute privilege to be a councillor. I know we're a diverse breed, aren't we, councillors? But to have the opportunity to try and do your bit for your community is something that I don't think just despite what the public may think of why we do it, our reasons and our rationale is very genuine. So I'm not standing down as much as not standing again. I think 8 years I stood for very specific reasons to try and get some more infrastructure for my village, and hopefully I've done my bit. Hopefully we all make a difference. But you've been a fantastic team. We've had some challenging things to debate, but a huge thank you to all the officers that have supported us, especially Mr. Green, who's worked incredibly hard with all our different budget modelling that we've asked you to do, and obviously we've been very privileged tonight to have James, and we can see how hard you've been working, James, with the detail of the action plan. We've had 3 clerks and they've all been exemplary, and if we're talking about long service medals, the lady sitting next to me really should have one, because how many years have you done, Debbie? Do you want to go on record with this? Maybe she doesn't want to go on record, but if anyone deserves a long service medal, it's the lady sitting next to me. But thank you, Councillor Perry, as well, for attending every meeting as lead member as well. So thank you, members, and I will draw this meeting to a close. Thank you for your attendance.